As a kingdom, Rohan is seemingly neatly divided into 6 major regions: the Fold or the King's Land, the West Fold, the East Fold, the West Emnet, the East Emnet, and the large northern region of the Wold. But in actuality, Rohan has a 7th region. This region is oft forgotten on the maps, it's geographically isolated, and it has a controversial history. In this video, we talk about the West March, Rohan's traitorous 7th province. If you look at a map of Middle-earth, you will not find the West March. It doesn't have a label. So the only way you can know where it is if, well, you know where it is from reading a bunch of the source material. But never fear, as you can see, the West March is here. It's the triangular slice of land that is wedged between the River Adorn, the River Eisen, and the White Mountains. As you can also see, the West March is rather isolated from the rest of Rohan. It's the only region of Rohan that is on the west side of the White Mountains, and it's only connected by a very narrow strip of land between the White Mountains and the River Eisen. And yes, the West March is part of Rohan. In 2510, when Eorl the Young and Steward Kirion of Gondor made the Oath of Eorl, the Gondorian province of Carlinadon was gifted to the Aethiod, who would become the Rohirrim. When the borders of Rohan were defined, it was explicitly mentioned that the western border was not the River Eisen at the Gap of Rohan, but rather where the Eisen and the Adorn reached their junction, much further to the west. Administratively, it was probably considered part of the Westmark alongside the Westfold and the West Emnet. But although the West March was part of Rohan on paper, in practice the situation was complex. By the time of the Oath of Eorl, Gondor's grip on Carlinadon was weak. Most of the dwindling population that remained dwelt in the eastern part of the province where they could defend Anduin. In the west, Gondor still had garrisons at Aglarond, later known as Helm's Deep, and Angrenost, Isengard. The garrison at the latter had gradually merged with Dunlending peoples from the west, and Dunlendings had crossed the Eisen, establishing settlements in western Carlinadon. So when the Rohirrim arrived, the Dunlendings regarded them as invaders, even though the Rohirrim were technically the legal owners of the land. Although the Rohirrim were initially occupied with Easterling invasions, this had changed by the reign of the third king Aldor, and during his reign the Dunlendings were driven back west of the Eisen. Aldor even raided across the Eisen into the Dunlending lands in Enedwaith. It's fairly likely that the West March only started to be settled by the Rohirrim around this time, the last of Rohan's 7 regions. And it's likely due to this late settlement and the West March's geographical isolation that it developed a different identity to the rest of Rohan. You see, the West March was only connected to the rest of Rohan by a narrow strip of land, but it shared a massive northern, western, and southern border with lands inhabited by Dunlendings. As a result of these factors, the people of the West March ended up being of mixed descent, descended from both Dunland and Rohan. Unfortunately, this would end up causing problems for Rohan. This problem emerged in the form of a man named Freca, who was born probably early in the 28th century. He was a powerful lord in the West March. He had a fortress at the source of the River Adorn and possessed lands on both sides of the river, meaning he controlled territory that was actually not part of Rohan. Although he claimed descent from King Freawain, Rohan's 5th king, he was said to be mostly Dunlending on account of having dark hair. And rather annoyingly for King Helm Hammerhand, Freca was ambitious and insolent, ignoring the king and acting with a great deal of autonomy. Freca's insolence eventually led to Helm killing him. Murdering him, really. It was pretty much murder. Helm then declared Freca's kinsmen to be his enemies, and aware that Freca was powerful and beloved in the West March, he immediately sent riders into the West March to quell any chance of rebellion. This did not have the desired result. Freca's son, Wulf, escaped to Dunland, where he was accepted. After all, the West Marchers were related to the Dunlendings as well. Over the previous century, the Dunlendings had grown powerful and were far more bold in their dealings with Rohan. 4 years later, in 2758, Wulf and his army would invade Rohan. Helm was defeated in the Westfold and retreated into the Hornburg, Helm's Deep. Wulf captured Edoras, and with Easterlings invading from the east, Rohan was seemingly finished. However, the war was put on hold due to the long winter, when Rohan was covered in snow for the better part of 5 months. Everyone suffered during this time. Neither Helm or his two sons survived, but Wulf was killed shortly after spring broke, when Freolaf, Helm's nephew, led a desperate surprise attack upon Edoras. The Gondorians, who had just driven back a Corsair invasion, sent help to Rohan from both east and west. The Dunlendings were defeated, and Isengard, which had been in Dunlending hands for over 50 years, was retaken. Shortly afterwards, it was handed over to Saruman. Although Wulf had been killed and the Dunlendings defeated, the Rohirrim were left incredibly weak after the war, so weak in fact that they didn't actually retake the West March. It's said that the land remained occupied by the Dunlendings, and as later events would reveal, much of the population was completely fine with this. This status quo continued for over a century as first Rohan recovered, and then later had to deal with a migration of orcs from the Misty Mountains. But by the time of King Folkwyne, who ascended the throne in 2864, Rohan had recovered its strength. At full muster, it said that Rohan could now raise at least 12,000 riders. Sometime during his reign, probably earlier, Folkwyne decided that enough was enough, and after a century of independence, he reconquered the West March, driving out the Dunlendings, and once again integrating the region into Rohan. On the other side of the Eisen, the Dunlendings were powerless to do anything about it. That being said, Folkwyne's reconquest was not a magic bullet that fixed all of the issues in the West March. Once again, many of the people there were of mixed descent, and owing to the fact that they had been independent for over a century, most of them were probably more loyal to Dunland at this point. And even though he had been dead for over a century, the people there remembered Freca fondly, and hadn't forgiven Rohan for its role in his death. On top of all that, in the middle of the 30th century, Saruman began to aid the enemies of Rohan, the Dunlendings being the obvious choice, and this certainly would have increased the anti-Rohan sentiment. So, rather predictably, when the War of the Ring erupted, the West March, while nominally still part of Rohan, was not exactly loyal, and the Rohirrim were aware of this. When Theodred is retreating from Isengard, he does not consider a retreat into the West March a possibility if the eastern side of the Fords of Eisen are held against them, though, to be fair, it's said that only strong swimmers could cross the Eisen away from the fords. At the first battle of the Fords of Eisen, some of the Rohirrim are driven south along the line of the Eisen, and then are driven westwards, but they don't trust in retreating into the now hostile West March, so instead, they prepare to make a last stand on a hill, but are saved when the Uruks suddenly retreat. None of this wariness ended up being unfounded. Many of the West March's warriors actually sided with Saruman against Rohan. These traitorous Rohirrim, if you can call them that, you can probably just call them Dunlendings, never appeared on the battlefield as an identifiable independent unit. However, the Dunlendings were observed to have cavalry at the Fords of Eisen. It's possible that these horsemen actually came from the West March. No independent attack is recorded from the West March, so the traitors either crossed into Dunland before the war started, or they linked with Saruman's army after it had crossed the fords. Regardless, Saruman's power was crushed at both Isengard and at Helm's Deep. All of the Dunlendings who weren't killed at Helm's Deep surrendered. They were disarmed and forced to repair the damage to the Hornburg. Afterwards, they were set free, much to their surprise, on the condition they never crossed the Fords of Eisen in force again, and that they never side with orcs again. Presumably, after the War of the Ring, the West March would have been reconquered yet again, although it may have been without bloodshed when you consider the previous conditions. In at least one version of the Legendarium, the Rohirrim would then themselves end up settling in the vast lands of Enedwaith beyond the Eisen, and in this scenario, you'd have to imagine that, now insulated from Dunland, the West March would have become far more loyal over time. I think the interesting thing about the West March is that it showed that the Rohirrim and the Dunlendings could actually live in peace. After all, it's not like they were so different. Both peoples were descended from the ancient Edain. Neither people had served Sauron and been moulded by that. Instead, their disputes were over land, and thanks to those political disputes, the West March was forced to choose sides every time, always picking Dunland, probably due to proximity and cultural influence. Instead, if some king of Rohan or some Dunlending chief had looked at the West March and thought, hey, that's not so bad, maybe we could sort of do that everywhere, then a lot of bloodshed might have been avoided. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I think the West March is a really underrated part of Tolkien's lore because it shows a mixing of people and cultures that has occurred constantly in human history. It makes the world feel more alive and less static. Sure, this place is part of Rohan, but is it really? And then you get to delve into all the little details that make it that way. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you're still idolizing a past leader to the point of where it shapes your current loyalties, even though that leader died long before you were born, you might be in North Korea.